Hi, welcome to Talking Books and Stuff, the program that talks all about books and writing and stuff. Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
And here we are. It's probably the new year where you are, because it is where we are. This is DR, the podcast guy, Dennis Rimmer. This is Talking Books and Writing and Stuff. So today we're talking about books and writing and cooking and stuff like that with Amy Jo Ehman. And good afternoon, Amy. Let's start off. Where are you situated right now?
I am in Saskatoon. That's where I live.
Are you in your kitchen or somewhere else?
No, actually, I've ensconced myself off into my office, so I am not in the kitchen at the moment.
Okay, and we just finished the holiday season, like you just told us. You were doing lots of holiday baking, I assume.
I did so much baking that I kind of got sick of Christmas cookies well before it was even Christmas.
Oh, no.
But I kept going. I stuffed them in the freezer, so they all got eaten. But yeah, I'm glad it's January now and I can just lay off the cookies for a while.
All right, Amy Jo Ehman with us today. What's your story? Where did life begin for you, and how did you get from there to where you are now? All in 10 easy words or less.
Well, I grew up on a farm at Prairie, Saskatchewan. That's a little town on the highway between Saskatoon and Regina. I had a set of grandparents in Regina and a set of grandparents in Saskatoon, so I knew both those cities well when growing up, but I ended up going to university in both of them. I have a degree in journalism and communications from the University of Regina, and set myself off on a career as a journalist. And I worked in a couple of places, in Ottawa, at the Ottawa Citizen for a little while early on. But the most substantial part of my career was both at the Star Phoenix in Saskatoon, and then I was a news reporter at CBC Television and CBC Radio based here in Saskatoon. So I got to know the province really quite well while I was doing that work. And I stayed there until about 2000, so I went on freelancing on my own. So since 2000, I've been doing my own thing. I've been writing for money, writing books, just kind of enjoying myself as a writer.
Great. Do you have a morning routine with your favorite beverage, anything like that? It gets you going in the day?
Well, that favorite beverage would be coffee, and yes, it does get me going in the day. How did you peg me so well on that?
Well, there's three choices, coffee, tea, or whiskey, so...
I'll save the whiskey for later. Nah.
Yep. Well, that's
yeah, so I'm not one of those people who gets up really early and starts writing. You know, I know some writers have really sort of set routines. You know, by this time they're working at it, and then at this time they take a break. I'm a little more, let's call it intuitive, or else maybe procrastinating, but I usually get to it sooner or later in the day, but not first thing. You know what I really like to do, Dennis, first thing in the morning is just to sit and drink my cup of coffee and read a book, because I am such a huge reader as well. And sometimes in the day we don't really find enough time to do that. So I think it's a good way to start the day, and it kind of gets my mind rolling in my own thought processes and my own creative juices going as I step out of my coffee mode and into work mode.
Right. You grew up, like you said, on a farm family in Craik or near Craik. Did you do much reading as a kid? I assume yes, but you never know.
Yeah, I guess I did. I remember reading all the time. I remember discovering the library in my school when I was quite young, and that was magical. There were always books in the house, and I don't recall my parents ever being restricting me as to what to read or telling me what to read. You know, my dad had this, he subscribed to something where it was like a classics library, and you'd get one every now and then, and it was all the classics in these little paperbacks. And I remember pouring through them, even though some of them were farther ahead in the, I wasn't old enough really to appreciate them. I still loved to read all those classics and those books. So I was reading from way back. I've loved to be a reader.
Is there any book, one book you can recall over the years that sort of influenced you the most, perhaps?
Oh my gosh, now you've put me on the spot because I'm not thinking of anything in particular. Nope, I'm not going to give you one book. Sorry, I know I had all the Nancy Drews and we had the Hardy Boys, but I can't really say those were terribly influential. You know what? I used to sit and just read through the World Book Encyclopedia. You know, if a person could just say if something was most influential, it might have been that.
Yes, we had one of those back, well, growing up in the 50s and 60s. I think every family had a knock on the door from a traveling encyclopedia salesperson. So we had the World Book of Knowledge and all that stuff, the encyclopedia, and I would just do that as well. Sit there and flip through them and pick up odd facts that, of course, I forgot the next day, but it's always nice. And I can't remember, if anybody asked me that question, I can't recall what book would influence me the most, because some that I read when I was young, I go back and they're not the same. So I don't know how to answer my own question. So let's talk about your writing, the books especially. The first ones you say were Prairie Feast and Out of Old Saskatchewan Kitchens. So what led you down that path other than loving food, and who doesn't, but...
Well, yes, and it was definitely food, and it was definitely my agricultural heritage. Growing up on the farm back in the 60s, we had huge gardens. We did a lot of canning and freezing. We kept chickens. I gathered eggs from a very early age. We kept a few pigs just for ourselves, and I remember those days when the slaughtering days, you know, when Grandpa and Grandma would come out from the city and the cousins would come, and it was a big day of processing. These sorts of memories stuck with me, except that by the time I was, you know, like in my 30s and working as a journalist on the Daily News, I'd really distanced myself from those sources of food that were in my community. I shopped at the grocery store like everybody else. But I started thinking about it, and a lot has changed in agriculture in Saskatchewan. We grow more things. For instance, when I was growing up, who ever heard of growing lentils or chickpeas? And now that's quite common out there. And so I was thinking of all these things that are now available in Saskatchewan that hadn't been there when I was a child, and wanting to research these things and bring them into my home. And because I was a journalist and I was freelancing at that time, I thought, well, this is a good opportunity to put my own interest into something, you know, go down that path of discovering things, meeting people, learning new things, but sharing it in some way as a writer with the world. And at that point, I got a column in the Star Phoenix, and it was a monthly column. And so every month I was sort of picking on something that I had investigated and brought into my house, into my kitchen in the course of that month, you know, to share the sources and recipes with people. So that eventually worked its way into my first book, Prairie Feast, because when I was done that year, man, I did so many cool things, you know. I went mushroom hunting up north with someone who knew what he was doing. I went to food festivals like the Blueberry Festival in St. Walburg and the Cherry Festival in Bruno, and I visited a spice farm. Like, I had no idea that there were farmers in Saskatchewan growing spices on such a huge scale. I remember I was in the combine, and the farmer was combining coriander. My goodness, what a beautiful lemony smell was coming up off the field. So all these wonderful things that I'd done. So I spun all these stories out of it, and that became my first book, Prairie Feast. So I have to say it was really a labor of love. I was serving my own interests, but I was trying to share it with the world.
Now, was that published, did a traditional publisher put that out for you?
My publisher for Prairie Feast was Coteau Books in Regina, and it came out in 2010.
And it's still available, I assume?
It's still available, yes. You can still find it in our local bookstores, absolutely.
Oh, good. And then Out of Old Saskatchewan Kitchens. Now, is that basically a cookbook, or am I misreading that?
Yeah, you got that right. I call it my historic cookbook because it is an historic book, and it contains a lot of recipes from the people who lived here in the early days. some of whom were indigenous to the land, the First Nations and the Métis people who lived here, and then the first early groups of settlers that came here. The recipes that they brought with them from home that they tried to continue making for their families because they were their cultural touchstones that reminded them of the land and the family that they'd left behind. But perhaps they couldn't make everything they used to make in Denmark and France and Germany and China once they were living here on this land. So they adopted them or made what they could from what they knew, what they remembered and brought with them from their homeland. But I call it an historic cookbook because there's a lot of text in it as well. So it's a book that you don't have to be a cook to read it, because what I wanted to do, what I did with it, is I wanted to retell the early history of Saskatchewan through the lens of food. Because of course you can read the headlines, you can look at the history books and see who the big names were, the premiers and the men and all the people and the big events of the day. But when it comes right down to it, one of the reasons Saskatchewan was created in the first place was to produce food. By I don't know, off the top of my head, it was like 1906, a year after Saskatchewan became a province, was calling itself the bread basket of the world. That was our raison d'etre when Saskatchewan was created, and farming is still an incredible part of our economy here in Saskatchewan. But when you think of all the people who lived on this land, from the First Nations people going way back to the settlers who came here, the number one priority in every day for every family was to feed their children, to feed their family. So I found it really challenging and super interesting to look at our province's history through that idea of feeding our families day after day, century after century.
Amy Jo Ehman is with us today. Prairie Feast, one of her books, out of old Saskatchewan kitchens. Another one, just the other night we had borscht and bannock for dinner. So I know of what you speak. I mean, where would we be without those foods?
Both of those recipes are in my historic cookbook, Out of Old Saskatchewan Kitchens. And wouldn't they just have to be? You cannot talk about food in Saskatchewan without talking about bannock. And you cannot talk about the early settlement days of Saskatchewan without talking about borscht.
Well, I know I didn't grow up here. I grew up on the West Coast, came back for high school, then left again. But our family farm is near Denholm. And speaking of family farms, I knew the day of the family farm was over. It was late 80s, early 90s. Came back for a visit, and my aunt had store-bought milk and store-bought bread. And I went, we're doomed. That's it.
That's probably the norm on most farms and most households today.
You also have a book about the provincial court in Saskatchewan.
That was kind of
that's a bit different here, right?
Okay, well that book came along because it was a commission, and I have a very good friend who sits as a judge of the provincial court, and this book had been thought about by provincial court judges for a while. Someone else had started doing some of the research and writing some of the early drafts of a couple of the chapters, and they really, really wanted it done for 2018. And so my friend who works on the court asked me if I would do it. It obviously has nothing to do with food, but it has a lot to do with Saskatchewan history, which is just totally, when you think of it, up my alley. And so I took on the challenge of doing that, and man, it was so interesting. I just loved every moment of doing it, because my goal, and I think one reason why they asked me to do it, they didn't want it to be a book that only people in the legal field would be interested in. Anyone who's interested in the history of Saskatchewan and the development of the courts or police services or some of the characters who were judges in the early days would find this book a really interesting read.
And you say it's available for free online?
Isn't that? Yeah, the judges really weren't interested in getting in the business of buying and selling this book. They printed a limited number of copies. They give them out to those persons who need to know about the court, people who are new judges on the provincial court bench. people who work in the judicial ministry at the government and that sort of thing, law schools, and they've got a copy in every library. So if a person really wants a hard copy, you can find it. But they just decided to make it available as a PDF online if anybody wanted to read it. So you can find it so it's on the Sask Law's website. You can find it by Googling, say, my name or the title of the book, Evolution of the Provincial Court of Saskatchewan and Sask Law. It's pretty easy to find. It pops up.
Okay, we'll pass that on. And Prairie Feast out of Old Saskatchewan Kitchens, then the Provincial Court book. You also had a Saskatoon, a History in Pictures, which again, completely different from, let's say, cookbooks.
Yes, once again, it wasn't cookbooks, but it's history, and it's the history of my city where I live now and have lived most of my adult life. And when I was writing Out of Old Saskatchewan Kitchens, it's just got a ton of historic archival pictures in it. Of course, all of those pictures have in some way to do with food. But while I was looking for those pictures, I saw so many other pictures that were so fun. And I wanted another way of using it. But I have to tell you, the honest truth is, this book wasn't my idea, the Saskatoon history. It was the same publisher. So Out of Old Saskatchewan Kitchens is published by McIntyre Purcell. They're based in Halifax, Nova Scotia, or Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. And it was the publisher there, it was his idea. He would like to do a book about most of the major cities in Canada. And he asked me if I would do a history of my city. Well, and since I had already been immersing myself in all these archival photos of Saskatoon, so I decided I would do that. It doesn't have a lot of text. It's got a lot of pictures, and all the pictures have little captions on them. So it's pretty easy to read in small bits. And I tried to include stories in there that maybe you didn't find in all the other history books, just some little interesting tidbits about Saskatoon.
So how do you acquire rights to the archival pictures? Is it an easy process, or do you have to jump through a bunch of hoops?
No, the archives make it fairly easy for you to use their photographs. I think they pride themselves on saving these photos for posterity, but they want them used. They want people to access them for book projects or for other reasons. So there's usually an online request form. There's often a fee if you're publishing something for which you are selling to make money for, which a book is obviously. So there's often a fee that you have to pay to the archive, but it's not a great fee. So it's a little bit of a cost of doing business if you're using them to produce a book, but not prohibitive in most cases.
Gotcha. And Amy Jo Ehman is with us, a writer. Are you a foodie? Would you call yourself a foodie?
I have been known to call myself a foodie, yeah, I guess. And I love food, and I love cooking, and I love sharing it with people. I'm not doing as much cooking. I was going to say the word experimental, but when I was for a while, for 10 years, I wrote a food column in the Star Phoenix. I think I mentioned earlier in our conversation that when I started writing about local food around Saskatchewan, I asked the Star Phoenix if I could have a column. I actually kept that column for 10 years, and I finally let it go after 10 years because it was, a time had come to go. But while you're writing a food column, man, you've got to be experimenting and trying new things all the time and coming up with new recipes. So I don't do things that quite as extensive as I used to, but I'm still in the kitchen all the time. In fact, now, sometimes when I want to cook something, I pull my cookbook off the bookshelf and I find my recipes and I cook them up. Especially for borscht and bannock, I always go to my own recipes.
As a professional writer, is there the hardest lesson you had to learn?
I guess being a professional writer, so I guess there's sort of been two phases in my life like that, because for, I guess like about 17 years or so, I was a freelance writer. So I was trying to make a buck with every story that I wrote. I was trying to sell them. I was trying to market myself to publications and broadcasters, and you're in a world like that, you've always got several things simmering away that you're working on. So you have to have quite a bit of discipline to, you have to have all your deadlines marked on the calendar and have it thought out of how you're going to accomplish everything that you need to do and get it done on those deadlines. And I guess one of my big pieces of advice is deadlines, follow them, don't miss deadlines.
Right.
You've got to be able to stick to deadlines. But now I'm mostly writing books, and I don't freelance so much anymore. I'm certainly not out there pushing myself. I'll do a thing now and then if someone comes to me and asks me to do it. So I think the big thing for me now, if I was going to say, to someone who wanted to follow that path of just being a writer, is to follow your heart, follow your passions, find out who else wants to read about it, and, sort of put it together and market it where you can. I've gone the route of having publishers, but now the self-publishing world is becoming so accessible and so prolific that a person can be their own publisher now too. I think it's quite accessible.
Oh yes, it is. And also you have a couple projects now, A History of Wheat. And I'm surprised that has anyone ever done that before?
Have you ever heard people say, if you're looking for a book and you want to read and you can't find it, then you need to write it. That's what they say to writers.
Right.
And I was looking, there's no book. I'll say that and knock on wood when it'll come out tomorrow, but there's no real comprehensive book on the history of wheat out there right now. And I grew up on a wheat farm. I thought, who's better to write this but me?
That's right.
So, but I've been actually working on it for a long time. I started it before I started any of these books. So it's just I've been putting it aside and doing other things as they come along. And I've done it once more. I'm working on another book right now. But as soon as this one's done, this current book with the current deadline is done, I'm going back to wheat, and I'm not doing anything else until that book is on the bookshelf, because it's time that saw the light of day.
Well, it's something you can really sink your teeth into. Yes, okay.
But the project that's right now that's occupying my heart and soul is I'm writing a biography of a woman in Saskatoon. His name is Thelma Pepper. Thelma was a photographer and received some acclaim for her photographs in the 80s and 90s. She had some shows in galleries, including at the Mendel Art Gallery here in Saskatoon, Dunlop in Regina, a gallery, I think it was called the Little Gallery in Prince Albert, and her shows went across Canada, and her photography is really beautiful, always black and white. She photographed a lot of people and small and disappearing prairie towns. And Thelma is now 99 years old, but I tell you, Thelma has a better memory than I do. So we're spending a lot of time together looking at her photographs and her life story, and we're writing a biography. I say I'm writing it with her and about her, because we're definitely doing this together. So that's been very much a pleasure, and very much that book that's expected to come out next fall here in Saskatoon.
Because that was the next question, was when is it due? Because you're working on a deadline, so you have to have that done.
I'm trying to have it all done by the 1st of March. But my deadline is actually the end of March, but I'm trying to trick myself into getting it done early. Do you think I can actually do that? We'll see.
Well, I hope so. Amy Jo Ehman, you worked in newspapers for a long time. Any thoughts on how newspapers, what do they have to do to survive?
Goodness gracious. I got out of newspapers before they really started having to compete with the digital age. By the digital age, I was working in broadcasting and radio and television. So I'm not really the most knowledgeable person on that. But if I had to make a guess, I would say if they're covering the local news, it's the only place where people in the local community can get what's going on in their community. If they're assigning people to go out and cover the local information, then that makes them relevant in their home community. So we'll see. I don't know. I really don't know. I'm not the best person to ask on that. Although I will say there was recently at the end of 2019, the newspaper that serves my home community, Craig, Saskatchewan, it's produced in Davidson, but it serves a number of communities around there. The owner decided that she was no longer going to do it. She's moving on to other aspects of her life. And she had a contest to give the newspaper away for $1. And people had to write in an essay as to why they wanted to run the small town newspaper. I bet their answers would be super interesting to read, why people believed in a small town newspaper. And I just read that she picked someone. They've got a great team going to take over that newspaper in Davidson, and I'm sure they're going to keep it alive and make it very relevant and keep it going for the local communities.
Well, I've heard something, some rumblings to the effect that local weeklies are actually thriving, if not thriving, then at least holding their own, whereas the big city type dailies are the ones that seem to be falling by the wayside. So I don't know how accurate that is, but it gets, what bothers me is like the Star Phoenix or Bellingham Herald in Bellingham, Washington. I used to write a column for them. They now print a 10-page paper and charge you $1.50 for it. And I don't understand how giving people less and charging more for it is a good business model. So
What's lying behind that, of course, is any publication, whether it's a newspaper or a magazine, what really funds it is the advertising. So that means the advertising has fallen off to a point where it's no longer subsidizing the cover price.
Well, they should look on.
To charge more.
They should get a new business model of some sort to revamp the way they approach ads. So, but who am I to say?
And I've never really been in advertising, so I can't really speak too much to that side of the business.
Amy Jo Ehman is with us. If you're looking for her books, The Prairie Feast, Out of Old Saskatchewan Kitchens, a book called Saskatoon, A History in Pictures. You can go online, Sask Law's website, that's Sask Law's website, for a book on the history of judges and the judicial process in the province. Working on a book about wheat. We'll have a book out soon about Thelma Pepper, a Saskatoon photographer, approaching 100. Before we go, Amy, what's your favorite food?
Oh, my goodness, my favoriteest food. If I had to pick any category of food, I'd probably say pasta and bread, and maybe that's why I'm writing a book about wheat, huh? You know, I love making bread. My first real love in the kitchen, I totally immersed myself with making bread, and that is still one of my first loves, my greatest loves in the kitchen. I love baking and eating bread and pasta and pies. Oh, yes, I love making pies. Okay, so the one thing those all have in common is wheat.
Is wheat, flour.
That's me.
Is there a favorite meal that combines any of that stuff?
Well, there's always pie for dessert, I guess.
Yep.
I love serving. I love serving friends and making meals and putting all those things on the table. Maybe not all at the same time, but a good pasta meal is fun to make and share.
Exactly. Favorite time of year? Do you have a favorite time of year?
I'm going to have to say spring. I'm very sentimental. I was born in spring. Lilacs, I get kind of weepy at lilac time. I don't know. Spring is a special time for me. So, yes, spring. And we're on our way to spring. Yay.
Yay. And you said the Saskatoon is your favorite city. Why would you live in Saskatoon? What's so great about Saskatoon?
Oh, well, I love Saskatoon because I guess I've been here for so long now, but it's a beautiful city with the river and the bridges, and I now live in the neighborhood of Nutana, so I'm right on the river. I run on the river trails, and there's great hiking and great restaurants, and it's my people are here, my friends and my community, so I think Saskatoon is a great place to live. Not saying that anywhere else isn't great too. Every city in this province, every town in this province has its charms. But right here now, Saskatoon is my place.
Amy Jo Ehman, thank you very much. How can we get in touch? Do you have like a website or things like that for people to maybe discover more?
Yeah, people can connect with me. I'm on all the socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I have a website. It's my initials and last name, ajehman.com. And I have a food blog. It's called Home for Dinner. So, and you can connect to it through my website, or you go to homefordinner.blogspot.com. Lots of recipes on my blog of Saskatchewan ingredients and things you can do with them.
There you have it. Amy Jo Ehman been with us today, a food writer, historian, all around great person. Look her up online like she just said. So thank you very much, Amy.
Thank you. I just so much appreciate what a great conversation we've had today.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.
I hope you've been enjoying Talking Books and Stuff. Please support us on Patreon to help cover our costs. Please click on the Patreon links, or you can visit our GoFundMe page. Thank you.